I want to start with a number, 1820. That's the year history tells us Antarctica was discovered. First sighted, first recorded, first acknowledged by the modern world. For most people, that date passes without a second thought. It sits quietly in textbooks and timelines, just another historical milestone we absorb in school without questioning. But the moment you stop and look at that number carefully, something begins to feel off. Because the real mystery isn't that Antarctica was discovered in 1820. The real mystery is why it happened exactly then. After thousands of years of seafaring civilizations, after the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese, and every major maritime culture that ever sailed open water, somehow the largest landmass in the southern hemisphere remained completely unknown, undiscovered, unmapped, unnamed, until 1820. And then suddenly, almost overnight, it appears in the historical record. Not slowly, not gradually, but all at once. 3 separate expeditions from 3 different nations, Russia, Britain, and the United States, arriving in roughly the same region within months of each other. That alone would be unusual. But what makes it far more interesting is what happened just 4 years earlier. In 1816, something extraordinary occurred, something historians still struggle to fully explain. The entire northern hemisphere experienced what became known as the year without a summer. Temperatures collapsed, crops failed across continents. Snow fell in June. Harvests were destroyed from New England to northern Europe. Livestock died. Famine spread. The sky itself behaved strangely, with reports of deep red and purple sunsets appearing across the world. Official history gives us a neat explanation. The eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, a powerful volcanic explosion that filled the atmosphere with ash and cooled the planet. It's a clean answer, convenient, easy to teach. But when you begin examining the historical reports more closely, the scale of what happened in 1816 becomes difficult to fit into that single explanation, because this wasn't a regional climate disturbance, it wasn't even continental. The disruption was global, simultaneous, and severe enough to destabilize societies across multiple continents at the same time, which raises a question that very few historians seem eager to explore. What if 1816 wasn't just a natural disaster? What if it was the final moment of something much larger, the collapse of an entire world that existed before ours? And if that's the case, then the discovery of Antarctica in 1820 begins to look less like a coincidence and more like the beginning of a cover story. History remembers 1816 as the year without a summer. Officially, the explanation is simple: the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in 1815. According to the mainstream record, the volcano expelled enormous amounts of ash into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and lowering global temperatures. Crops failed, harvests collapsed, entire regions experienced cold weather in the middle of summer. On paper, the explanation sounds reasonable. One volcano, one atmospheric effect, 1 year of unusual climate. But the deeper you go into the historical reports, the harder it becomes to ignore the scale of what actually happened. Because this wasn't just a slightly colder season. Across North America and Europe, farmers recorded frost in June and July. Snow fell in places where summer should have been warm. Crops failed across entire continents at the same time. Livestock died in large numbers. Food shortages triggered riots, migrations, and economic collapse in multiple regions simultaneously. Witnesses also described strange atmospheric effects, deep red and orange sunsets, dim sunlight, and a persistent haze in the sky. What makes this event difficult to ignore is the uniformity. The disruption wasn't localized near Indonesia. It appeared everywhere, almost at once. Reports came from New England, France, Germany, Switzerland, and as far north as Scandinavia. Entire societies experienced the same atmospheric disturbance at the same moment in history. And it didn't just affect the environment. The years immediately following 1816 saw massive social disruption. Populations relocated, institutions collapsed. Entire communities seemed to lose continuity with what came before them. In historical records, something strange begins to appear during this period. Cities that seem to restart, infrastructure that suddenly appears without clear construction history, and a timeline that feels interrupted. It's almost as if the early 19th century marks the boundary between two different worlds, one that existed before and the one we inherited afterward. This is where an alternative possibility begins to take shape. What if the atmospheric event of 1816 wasn't simply volcanic? What if Tambora was only part of the story? Because the environmental signature of that year, global darkness, sudden cooling, widespread collapse, resembles something else we understand today. A nuclear winter scenario, the kind of atmospheric blackout caused by a civilization-scale catastrophe. If something like that occurred in the early 19th century, it would explain more than just strange weather. It would explain why so many systems, cities, and societies appear to reset at almost the exact same moment in history. And it would also explain why, only 4 years later, the most remote and frozen landmass on Earth suddenly appears in the historical record. Antarctica, officially discovered in 1820. If the events of 1816 truly marked the collapse of something larger, the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly ended? Because when researchers begin looking closely at the early 19th century, they start noticing patterns that don't quite fit the official historical timeline. Across multiple continents, North America, Europe, Russia, even parts of South America, there are cities that appear in the historical record already equipped with massive infrastructure, cathedrals in frontier towns, elaborate municipal buildings in settlements that supposedly had only a few thousand residents, sewer systems, canals, and stone architecture that would normally require decades of labor, advanced engineering knowledge, and enormous financial resources. Yet in many cases, the documentation of how these structures were built is surprisingly thin or missing entirely. Buildings appear fully formed in photographs and early records with no clear construction phase preceding them. Even stranger are the recurring physical anomalies seen in older cities. Ground floors partially buried, windows that begin below street level, doorways that appear to have been swallowed by rising ground. Entire lower levels of buildings that seem to exist beneath the modern street surface. This pattern appears repeatedly across different regions of the world, and in places that had no historical connection to each other. The explanation usually given is gradual urban development, streets raised over time, natural sediment buildup, simple architectural evolution. But the deeper researchers dig into these examples, the more difficult it becomes to explain the consistency of the pattern, because it appears globally and always around the same historical boundary, the early 19th century. This is where the concept of Tartaria begins to enter the conversation. Not Tartaria as a traditional empire with borders on a map, but as a name used to describe the possibility of a lost or forgotten civilization that once existed across large portions of the world. A civilization that may have possessed advanced architectural techniques, large-scale infrastructure, and knowledge that later societies inherited but did not fully understand. In this interpretation, the buildings we attribute to 19th century settlers may not have been built by them at all. They may have been inherited, structures left behind by a civilization that vanished during the catastrophic transition around 1816. If such a civilization existed, it would explain why so many cities appear suddenly developed without the messy archaeological layers we would normally expect. It would also explain why the historical record around that time feels strangely incomplete, almost as if an entire chapter of human history was compressed, forgotten, or deliberately rewritten. And if that civilization truly collapsed during the atmospheric event of 1816, then the next piece of the puzzle becomes even more interesting. Because just 4 years later, in 1820, humanity suddenly discovers the most isolated continent on Earth, Antarctica. Now let's return to that date again. 1820, the year Antarctica officially enters the historical record. According to mainstream history, this was the moment when humanity first laid eyes on the frozen continent at the bottom of the world. But the details of that discovery are more unusual than most people realize. Antarctica was not discovered gradually. There wasn't a slow progression of sightings over decades. Instead, 3 separate expeditions from 3 different nations arrived in the region almost simultaneously. One Russian expedition led by Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen, one British expedition under Edward Bransfield, and an American expedition commanded by Nathaniel Palmer, all of them operating independently, all of them reaching the same general area within months of each other. Officially, this is explained as coincidence, multiple powers exploring the southern oceans at the same time, each hoping to discover new territory. And that explanation might sound reasonable at first, but when you zoom out and look at the broader timeline, the coincidence becomes harder to ignore. For thousands of years, humanity had explored nearly every corner of the known world. Ancient civilizations crossed oceans, charted coastlines, and mapped entire regions with surprisingly accurate navigation tools. The Phoenicians sailed across the Mediterranean. The Polynesians navigated the Pacific using the stars. European explorers crossed the Atlantic and circled the globe centuries before the 19th century. Yet somehow the largest landmass in the southern hemisphere remained completely unknown until 1820. Not one civilization recorded it. Not one expedition documented it. Not one major maritime culture mentioned it clearly in their surviving records. Then suddenly, just 4 years after the global catastrophe of 1816, 3 nations appear at its doorstep, almost at the same time. That raises a simple but powerful question. Were they truly discovering Antarctica for the first time, or were they returning to something that had already been known? Because when researchers began examining historical cartography, the old maps preserved in archives and libraries, they found something that complicates the official story even further. Antarctica may have appeared on maps centuries before 1820. If Antarctica was truly discovered in 1820, then older maps should reflect that. Before the 19th century, the southern hemisphere should appear mostly empty, uncharted ocean, speculative coastlines, vague guesses drawn by cartographers who simply imagined what might exist at the bottom of the world. But that's not always what we find. One of the most famous examples is the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer. Piri Reis himself wrote that he compiled his map using several older sources, maps that already existed long before his time. What makes this map remarkable is the southern portion. It appears to depict a large landmass at the bottom of the world with a detailed coastline. Not a rough guess, not a symbolic shape, but a coastline drawn with surprising precision. In the 20th century, some researchers compared the outline on the Piri Reis map with modern satellite measurements of Antarctica's subglacial terrain, the land hidden beneath the ice. And certain sections appear to align in ways that are difficult to dismiss entirely as coincidence. Another map raises even more questions. The Orontius Phineus map, published in 1531. This map depicts a massive southern continent that strongly resembles Antarctica. But unlike the Antarctica we know today, the land on this map appears ice-free. Rivers flow across the surface. Mountain ranges divide the terrain. Internal geography is drawn with striking detail. What makes this even stranger is that many of these internal features were not confirmed until the mid-20th century, when sonar and radar technology allowed scientists to scan the rock beneath Antarctica's ice sheet. In other words, a 16th century map appears to show geographic features that humanity officially did not confirm until the 1950s. The academic explanation is usually one of 3 things: coincidence, imaginative speculation by early cartographers, or philosophical symmetry, the idea that map makers assumed a large southern landmass must exist to balance the continents in the north. But those explanations begin to struggle when the details become too specific. It's one thing to imagine a continent, it's another to draw coastlines, mountain ridges, and river systems that later match features hidden beneath miles of ice. Because cartographers don't normally invent details like that. They copy them from observation, from records, or from older maps, which leads to a mystery that still doesn't have a satisfying answer. If those 16th century cartographers were copying from earlier sources, then who originally mapped Antarctica, and when? When you read the notes left by early cartographers, one detail appears again and again. They rarely claim to be the original creators of their maps. Instead, they describe themselves as compilers. People who gathered fragments of older geographic knowledge and assembled them into new charts. Piri Reis was very clear about this. In his own writings, he explained that his famous 1513 map was created using multiple earlier maps as sources, some from Portuguese explorers, some from Arab cartographers, and others that were already considered ancient even in his time. Those earlier maps, however, are mostly lost. Their names are mentioned, but the physical documents themselves have disappeared from the historical record, which creates a strange situation. We possess copies of maps that supposedly originated from much older geographic knowledge, but the original sources are gone, and that raises a deeper question. If Antarctica appears on maps centuries before its official discovery, that knowledge had to travel through a chain of hands across time. Someone mapped it, someone preserved the information, someone copied it. Adi empires, and someone carried that knowledge forward long enough for cartographers in the 16th century to draw it again. That chain had to survive wars, collapsing empires, and shifting political powers. It had to survive centuries of historical upheaval. More importantly, it appears to survive the mysterious rupture around the early 19th century, the same period when the atmospheric catastrophe of 1816 disrupted societies across the world. If an advanced civilization once existed before that period, the possibility emerges that some fragments of its knowledge may have survived through hidden or inherited records, maps, charts, geographic data copied and recopied across generations. And if those fragments still existed by the early 19th century, they may explain something else that otherwise looks like coincidence: the sudden convergence of multiple expeditions in 1820, Russia, Britain, the United States. 3 separate nations arriving in the same region of the Southern Ocean within months of each other. Perhaps they weren't blindly searching at all. Perhaps they were following the same ancient trail of information. And if that trail led them to Antarctica, then the next chapter of the story becomes even more interesting, because Antarctica didn't stop attracting attention after 1820. In fact, one of the largest expeditions ever sent to the continent would happen more than a century later, immediately after the end of World War II. Jump forward to 1946, just 1 year after the end of World War II. The world was still recovering from the largest conflict in human history when the United States launched something unusual, a massive Antarctic operation known as Operation High Jump. Officially, it was described as a scientific and training mission. Its purpose was to test equipment in extreme cold, train personnel for polar conditions, and conduct aerial mapping of the continent. On the surface, that explanation sounds routine. But the scale of the operation tells a different story. Operation High Jump included 13 ships, 33 aircraft, and nearly 5,000 military personnel. It was commanded by Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd, one of the most experienced polar explorers and naval officers in American history. For a continent that supposedly contained nothing but ice, wind, and penguins, the size of the mission was extraordinary. This wasn't a small scientific research trip. It was a full-scale military deployment to the most remote place on Earth. And it happened almost immediately after the end of the war, during a time when military resources were stretched thin and global priorities were focused elsewhere. That alone would raise questions. But the story becomes even more interesting when we look at who had already shown interest in Antarctica before the United States arrived. Because the Americans were not the first major power exploring that frozen continent during the 20th century. In fact, nearly a decade earlier, another government had already launched its own Antarctic expedition, one surrounded by mystery and incomplete records. In 1938, Nazi Germany sent an official mission to Antarctica. The expedition explored and mapped a region they called Neuschwabenland. Aircraft from the mission reportedly surveyed nearly 600,000 square kilometers of territory, dropping thousands of metal markers stamped with German insignia to claim the land. What exactly they were searching for remains unclear. The official documentation is incomplete in ways that historians often find frustrating. But what we do know is that certain figures within the Nazi scientific community had a deep fascination with ancient civilizations, lost knowledge, and the possibility of forgotten technologies from earlier human cultures. The same themes that appear in the mystery surrounding ancient maps and pre-modern geographic knowledge, which raises another uncomfortable possibility. By the time the United States arrived in Antarctica in 1946, the continent may have already been the subject of serious geopolitical interest for nearly a decade. And that leads directly to the next development, one of the most unusual international agreements ever signed. In 1959, something remarkable happened. At the height of the Cold War, a time when nations disagreed about almost everything, 12 countries came together to sign what became known as the Antarctic Treaty. Over time, more nations joined. Today, more than 50 countries are part of the agreement. The treaty declared Antarctica a continent dedicated to peaceful purposes and scientific research. Military activity was banned. Nuclear testing was prohibited. Mineral extraction was restricted. On the surface, the treaty appears noble, an international commitment to preserve one of the last untouched regions of the planet. But when you step back and examine the situation carefully, the agreement raises a curious question. Because global cooperation on this scale is extremely rare. Nations argue about borders, trade, resources, ideology, and territory. The 20th century itself was defined by conflict between major powers. Yet somehow, on the subject of Antarctica, those same nations reached a level of consensus that almost never happens elsewhere. Dozens of governments, many of them geopolitical rivals, agreed to maintain the same restrictions for decades. Antarctica became, in practice, the only continent on Earth that ordinary individuals cannot freely explore. Yes, scientific teams travel there. Governments maintain research stations. Even tourism exists in controlled forms along the outer edges of the continent. But independent exploration of the interior is almost impossible without institutional backing. The logistical barriers alone make it nearly unattainable for private individuals. Permits are difficult to obtain, infrastructure is limited, travel requires enormous resources. The result is that Antarctica remains effectively out of reach for most of humanity. And strangely, very few people question this arrangement. We accept that it exists for environmental protection, scientific cooperation, and global peace. Those explanations may very well be true. But when you combine this treaty with everything that came before the ancient maps, the sudden discovery in 1820, the military expeditions, and the persistent gaps in historical records, the pattern begins to feel unusual. Because if Antarctica truly contains nothing more than ice, wind, and wildlife, then the level of international coordination surrounding it becomes difficult to explain. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. What lies beneath the ice itself? Today, we live in the most technologically advanced period in human history. Satellites orbit the planet, mapping every coastline and mountain range with extraordinary precision. Radar systems can penetrate deep underground. Ground-penetrating sensors can reveal structures buried beneath deserts, forests, and even ocean floors. We can scan archaeological ruins hidden under dense jungle canopies. We can map caves thousands of meters below the surface. And yet, when it comes to Antarctica, large portions of the continent's subglacial terrain remain only partially mapped in high resolution. Scientists have made significant progress using radar and satellite imaging to study the land beneath the ice sheet. We know there are mountain ranges, valleys, and enormous lakes hidden under miles of frozen ice, but the data is still incomplete, especially in the deep interior of the continent. Antarctica is covered by ice that can reach 2 miles thick in some regions. Beneath that frozen layer lies an entire landscape that humanity has barely explored. Ancient river systems, massive mountain ranges, subglacial lakes that have been sealed off from the surface for millions of years. From a scientific perspective, Antarctica is one of the least understood environments on Earth, and that is understandable. The conditions are extreme, the terrain is vast, and the logistics of exploration are incredibly difficult. But when you place this reality alongside the older historical questions, the mystery begins to deepen. If ancient cartographers truly drew maps showing parts of Antarctica centuries before its official discovery, if those maps appear to depict the land without ice, if a global catastrophe occurred in 1816 that may have reshaped climate systems across the planet, and if the continent itself became the focus of military expeditions and international treaties in the decades that followed, then the final question becomes unavoidable. What exactly lies beneath the ice of Antarctica? Is it simply untouched geological terrain, or could it contain traces of something older, remnants of a civilization whose existence has faded from the historical record? I'm not claiming to have that answer, but when you follow the timeline carefully, 1816, 1820, the ancient maps, the expeditions, the treaty, the pattern begins to form a shape that is difficult to ignore. And once you see that shape, it becomes almost impossible to stop asking the same question. If we take a step back and look at the entire timeline, a pattern begins to emerge. In 1816, the world experienced one of the most unusual atmospheric events in recorded history, the year without a summer. A global disruption severe enough to trigger famine, social instability, and widespread environmental collapse across multiple continents. Only 4 years later, in 1820, Antarctica officially appears in the historical record. Not gradually discovered, but suddenly reached by 3 different expeditions from 3 different nations within months of each other. At the same time, centuries-old maps seem to show a southern continent that resembles Antarctica long before that official discovery ever occurred. Maps that may have been copied from even older geographic knowledge that no longer survives in its original form. Then, more than a century later, Antarctica becomes the focus of enormous military interest. In 1938, Nazi Germany launches an Antarctic expedition mapping hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of territory. In 1946, the United States responds with Operation High Jump, one of the largest polar expeditions ever organized. And in 1959, during the Cold War, dozens of nations agree on something almost unheard of in geopolitics, a unified treaty restricting military activity and independent exploration across the entire continent. One frozen landmass. One global agreement, maintained for decades. Meanwhile, beneath Antarctica's ice lies an entire landscape that remains only partially explored, hidden under miles of frozen silence, mountain ranges, ancient river systems, massive subglacial lakes, a world that humanity has barely seen. So when people ask whether Antarctica could contain traces of something older, something connected to the mysterious gaps in early 19th century history, the honest answer is simple: we don't know. Maybe the continent holds nothing more than geology and ice. Or maybe it contains pieces of a much older story, one tied to the forgotten civilization some researchers call Tartaria. A civilization whose architecture appears across continents. A civilization that may have vanished during a catastrophic moment in the early 1800s. If that possibility is even partially true, then Antarctica might represent the final sealed chapter of that history. A continent frozen in time. A place where the last physical evidence of an earlier world may still exist, hidden beneath 2 miles of ice. I don't claim to have the final answer. But the timeline raises a question that becomes harder to ignore the longer you sit with it. What exactly were they protecting when Antarctica was sealed from the rest of the world?